70 seconds. That's how long the actual rupture process lasted beneath the seafloor off the southern Philippines. And in that 70 seconds, an entire region's landscape, economy, and thousands of lives were permanently altered. Since then, seismologists have recorded more than 8,000 aftershocks along the same fault system. 3 of them strong enough to be considered major earthquakes in their own right, and the monitoring hasn't stopped. I want to walk y'all through exactly what happened, why this specific stretch of ocean floor is so dangerous, and why scientists are still watching this fault system closely today. Let's start with the earthquake itself, because the scale of this event genuinely deserves a full explanation rather than a quick headline. On June 8th, 2026, at 7:37 in the morning local time, a magnitude 7. 8 earthquake struck the southern coast of Mindanao in the Philippines, with its epicenter located off the coast of Sarangani province, about 24 kilometers west-southwest of the coastal town of Cablalan. The earthquake was caused by subduction along the Cotabato Trench, a major earthquake-generating structure, and tsunami warnings were issued across the southern Philippines, as well as in countries throughout Oceania, East Asia, and Southeast Asia. This was the strongest earthquake to hit the Philippines since the devastating 1976 Morro Gulf earthquake, 5 decades earlier. I want y'all to understand just how significant that comparison to 1976 actually is. That 1976 earthquake, which struck the same general trench system, was a magnitude 8. 0 event that triggered a tsunami and killed 8,000 people. This year's earthquake didn't reach quite that same scale, but the fact that seismologists immediately reached for that historical comparison tells you everything about how seriously this event was treated the moment it happened. Let's talk about the actual human toll, because that's ultimately what matters most here. At least 81 people died, over 1,300 were injured, and 31 people were reported missing across Mindanao, making this among the most destructive earthquakes in the country in 5 decades. The city of General Santos, along with the provinces of Sarangani and South Cotabato in the Sarangani region and Davao Occidental in the Davao region, were the worst affected areas. Across Mindanao, nearly 113,300 homes were damaged or destroyed, along with numerous other buildings and facilities. The towns of Sarangani, Jose Abad Santos, Glan, and Malapatan had the highest percentage of homes affected, while more than 30% of homes were damaged in General Santos alone. The earthquake's reach extended beyond Philippine borders, too. It also caused severe damage, 1 death, and several injuries on the Sangihe and Talaud Islands of North Sulawesi in Indonesia. Now, let's get into the geology, because understanding why this happened and why it happened here specifically is genuinely important. Mindanao sits across the convergent boundary between the Sunda Plate and the Philippine Sea Plate, and part of the oblique convergence between these 2 plates is taken up by subduction along the Cotabato Trench. The Cotabato Trench lies off the southwestern coast of Mindanao, where oceanic crust of the Sunda Plate beneath the Celebes Sea subducts beneath what geologists call the Philippines Mobile Belt, and it forms part of a linked set of trenches along the western side of the Philippines, including the Manila Trench and the Negros Trench. At its northern end, the rate of convergence across this boundary runs at about 100 millimeters, or roughly 4 inches, per year, which is actually quite fast by tectonic plate standards. This isn't a fault system with a quiet history either. Major earthquakes struck this trench system in both 1918 and 1976, associated with ruptures on its southern and northern sections respectively. And that 1976 event involved a rupture spanning some 160 kilometers, nearly 100 miles, along the subduction zone beneath the Morro Gulf. This year's earthquake occurred near the southern tip of Mindanao, close to where the northwest trending Cotabato Trench actually joins the north-south trending Sangihe Trench. And seismologists believe the rupture likely involved either the northern Sangihe Trench, the southern Cotabato Trench, or some combination of both. That junction between 2 major trench systems is exactly the kind of structurally complex zone that seismologists watch closely, because it's genuinely capable of producing large, damaging earthquakes on a recurring basis. Let's talk about the physical process of the earthquake itself, because I think the mechanics here are worth understanding. The earthquake was caused by thrust faulting, and shaking was estimated to have lasted around 30 seconds at the surface, while the entire underlying rupture process took about 70 seconds to complete, releasing a seismic moment equivalent to over 600 quintillion newton meters of energy. The United States Geological Survey estimated a maximum Mercalli intensity of 9x, described as violent shaking, and according to USGS's Pager Impact Assessment Service, approximately 7,000 people were within that zone of most violent shaking in western Sarangani. An additional one, 51 million people were exposed to severe shaking, including in the cities of General Santos, Glan, and Pulamulok, while 2 million more people experienced very strong shaking across the Sarangani, Davao, and Bangsamoro regions, reaching as far as the cities of Digos and Davao City. At least 6. Over 4 million people in total were exposed to strong shaking across southern and central Mindanao. That's a genuinely staggering number of people affected by a single earthquake, and it helps explain why the damage was so widespread rather than confined to a small area immediately around the epicenter. Now let's talk about the tsunami, because this earthquake didn't just shake the ground, it also physically altered the coastline in ways that are honestly remarkable from a purely scientific standpoint. PHIVOLCS issued a tsunami warning for the provinces of Sarangani, Davao Occidental, Tawi-Tawi, Sulu, Basilan, and several others, prompting the evacuation of all residents and businesses along the coastline of those provinces, with around 10,000 families in Sarangani and Sultan Kudarat evacuated. The Pacific Tsunami Warning Center said parts of the Philippine coastline could experience waves up to 3 meters, or nearly 10 feet, while smaller waves were forecast to reach Indonesia and Malaysia. A subsequent field survey revealed a maximum tsunami run-up height of 5 meters, and an 18-meter inland run-in distance at Lebak in Sultan Kudarat province, and the tsunami actually traveled about a kilometer upstream via a nearby river mouth. In some areas, the tsunami damaged stilt homes and carried boats inland, and on Balut Island, the waves were powerful enough to carry large boulders and deposit them onto a reef flat, with one boulder measuring roughly 4 feet by 2 feet by 8 feet, displaced 30 meters by the force of the water. I want to highlight one detail from this earthquake that I think is genuinely remarkable from a geological perspective, something you don't get to talk about with most earthquakes. Along about 100 kilometers of coastline spanning the southern tip of Mindanao, primarily around the towns of Glan and Jose Abad Santos, the earthquake actually raised the area's coastline by up to 2 meters and moved it up to 200 meters seaward, exposing coral reefs and other areas that had previously been submerged, which affected the local marine environment. Think about that for a second. An earthquake powerful enough to permanently lift a stretch of coastline out of the ocean by 6.5 feet and push the shoreline itself over 600 feet further out to sea. That's the kind of raw tectonic force we're talking about with an earthquake of this magnitude, and it's a genuinely visible, lasting mark left on the physical landscape that will remain long after the immediate emergency response has wound down. Landslides were another major secondary hazard from this event, and this is directly relevant to why the death toll and missing persons figures took time to fully settle. Numerous landslides occurred across southern Mindanao, with 70 of them causing significant damage, primarily in the towns of Glan and Jose Abad Santos. One landslide in the barangay of Patulang in Jose Abad Santos measured 15 hectares, roughly 37 acres, with some other landslides in the same town measuring as large as 60 hectares. One barangay in southern Mindanao was almost completely buried by landslide debris, and a landslide dam actually created a new lake in barangay San Isidro. In total, the Philippine Space Agency identified approximately 87 hectares, or roughly 340 acres, of land affected by landslides across Sarangani and Davao Occidental. Landslides like these are part of why search and rescue efforts remained difficult and prolonged in some of the more remote mountainous areas, since roads were physically buried or cut off entirely, complicating access for emergency responders trying to reach isolated communities. Now, let's get to the part of this story that connects directly to the video's headline, because this is exactly why scientists continue watching this region closely even now, weeks and months after the main shock. PHIVOLCS recorded more than 8,500 aftershocks as of June 19th, including 3 events of magnitude 6, 0 or greater, with the largest aftershock reaching magnitude 6. 5. I want y'all to really absorb that number, over 8,000 aftershocks from a single main shock, because it illustrates just how much accumulated stress was released and continues to be redistributed across this fault system in the weeks following the initial rupture. 3 separate magnitude 6+ aftershocks are, on their own, significant earthquakes that would make headlines in almost any other context. And here, they're just part of the broader aftershock sequence following an even larger main shock. This is exactly why seismologists describe themselves as watching for continued activity, and I want to explain the actual science behind why that ongoing vigilance matters, rather than just repeating the phrase. When a major earthquake like this one ruptures a section of a fault or subduction zone, it doesn't necessarily release all of the accumulated stress across the entire fault system in one go. Instead, the initial rupture often transfers additional stress onto adjacent, still locked sections of the same fault system, sections that hadn't yet slipped. The transferred stress is exactly what drives the aftershock sequence, as those adjacent sections gradually adjust and release their own portion of accumulated energy, sometimes in the form of smaller aftershocks that decay in frequency over time following a predictable statistical pattern, but sometimes in the form of a genuinely significant secondary earthquake nearly as large as, or in some historical cases, even larger than, the original main shock. given that this earthquake occurred right at the junction between two major trench systems, the Cotabato Trench and the Sangihe Trench. Seismologists studying this region are paying particularly close attention to how stress has redistributed across both of these structures following the June rupture, because a junction zone like this is inherently more complex to model than a single, simple fault plane. Sections of either trench that didn't slip during the June earthquake, but that received additional stress as a result of it, remain areas of genuine scientific interest and monitoring priority, since understanding exactly how that stress has redistributed helps refine both the immediate aftershock forecast and the longer-term hazard assessment for this entire region going forward. Let's talk about the broader impact this earthquake had on daily life across the region, because I think it's important to understand just how comprehensively a disaster of this scale disrupts a community, well beyond the immediate structural damage. The Department of Education estimated more than 2 million students, 128,000 staff, and over 6,200 public schools across 33 school divisions were affected by the quake, which struck on the very first day of the new school year, with at least 1,022 schools damaged and over 8,200 classes suspended across the affected regions. That timing detail genuinely stands out to me. An earthquake this destructive striking on the first day back to school, with students literally gathered for their opening flag ceremony assembly when the shaking began. Power was also disrupted for more than 800,000 households across the affected provinces, as transmission lines serving Davao del Sur, Davao Occidental, and several other provinces sustained damage, with several power generating units placed on emergency shutdown, including 2 coal plant units with a combined 300 megawatts of capacity. The economic toll extended well beyond housing and infrastructure too. Property damage was valued at 1 billion pesos, roughly $20 million in General Santos alone, where 506 people were injured, 4,188 houses collapsed entirely, and over 50,700 others sustained partial damage, representing about 31% of all households in the city. Multiple significant buildings collapsed or sustained major damage in General Santos, including a building housing a Jollibee restaurant and a radio studio, a university building, and a shopping mall, while the General Santos City Hall itself partially collapsed. Even in Davao City, well away from the immediate epicenter, a 36-story high-rise condominium building was documented visibly swaying during the earthquake, and a concrete footbridge in the city collapsed entirely. I want to talk about the government and emergency response, because the scale of the mobilization here genuinely reflects how seriously this disaster was treated at every level. President Bongbong Marcos directed all government agencies to respond with 2,784 search, rescue, and retrieval personnel deployed across the affected areas, and an additional 1,475 responders kept on standby for immediate deployment, drawing from 23 teams of the Armed Forces of the Philippines, 310 teams from the National Police, 169 teams from the Coast Guard, and 510 teams from the Bureau of Fire Protection. States of calamity were formally declared in General Santos City and throughout the provinces of Davao Occidental, Sarangani, and South Cotabato. On June 10th, President Marcos personally visited General Santos to assess damage to a hospital and 2 schools and pledged financial assistance to the families of those who died in the earthquake. Vice President Sara Duterte attended the wake of several victims in Malapatan, Sarangani. International support arrived too, with UNICEF Philippines and neighboring Malaysia, both offering emergency assistance and monitoring support in the earthquake's immediate aftermath. Let's take a step back now and talk about what all of this means for the region going forward, because I think that's ultimately the most useful thing I can leave y'all with. This earthquake, and the aftershock sequence that has followed it, is a powerful reminder of exactly why the Philippines sits among the most seismically active countries on the planet. The archipelago is positioned along multiple active plate boundaries and trench systems simultaneously, not just the Cotabato and Sangihe trenches involved in this specific event, and that geological reality means significant earthquakes are not a rare, once-in-a-generation possibility here. They're a recurring feature of life in this region, as this event's direct historical echo of the 1976 Moro Gulf disaster demonstrates clearly. For residents across Mindanao and the broader Philippines, the practical takeaway from an event like this is the same one I'd give anyone living in a seismically active region anywhere in the world. Make sure your household has an actual earthquake plan, not just a general sense that you'd figure it out in the moment. Know the drop, cover, and hold on technique for when shaking actually starts. Keep an emergency kit stocked with water, non-perishable food, a flashlight, and a battery or hand crank radio that doesn't depend on the power grid or cellular networks, both of which, as we've seen, can be knocked out across huge areas simultaneously during a major earthquake. And for anyone living along the coast in a subduction zone region like this one, understand your local tsunami evacuation routes in advance, because, as this event demonstrated, tsunami waves can arrive at the coast in a matter of minutes following a strong offshore earthquake, leaving very little time to react if you're not already prepared with a clear plan. I also want to acknowledge, honestly, that recovery from a disaster of this scale is a genuinely long process, not something that wraps up once the initial search and rescue phase concludes. With well over 100,000 homes damaged or destroyed, thousands of displaced families, and significant damage to schools, hospitals, roads, bridges, and power infrastructure across multiple provinces, the rebuilding process here is very likely to extend across months and, in the hardest hit communities, years. That's the less visible, less headline-grabbing part of a disaster like this, the long tail of recovery that continues long after international news coverage moves on to the next story. And it's worth remembering that communities across Mindanao are still very much in the middle of that recovery process even now. I'll continue to keep an eye on developments across this region, including any updates on the ongoing aftershock sequence and the broader recovery effort, and I'll bring y'all more information if anything significant develops. My thoughts remain with everyone across Mindanao and the broader Philippines who has been affected by this earthquake and the extended aftershock sequence that followed it.